The elevator opened before Dot pressed the button. That was the first thing she noticed. Not unusual on its own, not the kind of detail that would mean anything on an ordinary afternoon. But she noticed it the way you notice something when your body knows before your mind does, the way a smell can stop you in a hallway before you have identified what the smell is. Two men stepped out. They were moving a mattress wrapped in clear plastic tilted at an angle to clear the elevator doors, and the one closest to her looked away before she could make eye contact. Not rudeness. Avoidance. The deliberate redirection of a person who does not want to answer the question their presence raises. Dot watched them maneuver the mattress toward the service entrance at the end of the corridor. She stood still with her purse on her shoulder, and the visitor sticker from the assisted living center still on her lapel. The one with her name printed in block letters because the front desk required it, and she had forgotten, as she always forgot, to remove it before leaving. Her hands still carried the faint smell of lavender. She had rubbed lotion into her sister's wrists that afternoon, the way she did every visit. Her sister's hands thin now in a way they had not been 5 years ago. The skin loose over the knuckles like paper that had been folded and unfolded too many times. The mattress was wrapped in the plastic that moving companies use when they are being careful. Professional. Paid in advance. Dot pressed the elevator button and rode up to the 14th floor. The door to the condominium was open. Not wide. Just enough that she could see light from the living room windows cutting across the hallway floor and hear the sounds that were coming from inside. The crinkle of packing paper. The pull and seal of tape from a dispenser. The careful footsteps of people moving through a space they have been hired to manage. She stood at the threshold. The living room had been reorganized in the way that only happens when someone is dismantling it rather than using it. Cabinet doors hung open. The lamps had been unplugged and stood together near the door like they were waiting for instructions. On the dining table, which she had refinished herself in the 2nd year of their marriage because the original finish had been wrong, and she had never been able to leave wrong things alone. There was a stack of adhesive labels. 3 colors. 3 words. Storage. Donation. Auction. A man she had never seen before was standing in the kitchen with a roll of paper and her mother's good glasses wrapping each one with the efficient care of someone who has done this job 100 times and feels nothing particular about any of it. He glanced up when she stepped inside. He had a clipboard. "Mrs. Marsh," he said, "we are trying to stay on schedule. Not a question. Not an apology. A logistical update delivered with the mild competence of a man who had been given a timeline and intended to meet it." She walked past him without responding. The dining room smelled of cardboard and the particular dust that comes from furniture that has been moved when it has not been moved in years, the underside of things. She passed the sideboard where she kept the good tablecloths and saw that the top drawer was already empty. She passed the bookshelf and saw that it had been cleared. The books stacked in a box on the floor, with the spines facing inward so they took up less space, which meant whoever packed them had not considered that this made them harder to identify and harder to return to their proper order. But that was not the kind of thing you thought about when your job was volume and speed rather than care. Then she saw the auction label. It was on her mother's serving bowl, the large white one with the blue rim that her mother had used every Thanksgiving until the year she no longer hosted Thanksgivings, and that Dot had wrapped in dish towels and driven 3 hours to Louisville when she and Clifford first moved into this condominium because she could not leave it behind. The label was yellow and bright against the white of the bowl, the word auction printed in clean black letters, as though it were any object with a market value, rather than the thing her mother had carried out of the farmhouse in Harlan County when she was 23 years old and starting a different kind of life. Beside it, also labeled, was the quilt her aunt had made. Dot stood very still. Her aunt had made that quilt over 2 winters. She had talked about it. Every time Dot visited, she talked about the stitching, about which scraps came from what old garments, about the way the pattern made a different shape depending on where you stood when you looked at it. She had given it to Dot the Christmas before she died because she said Dot was the only one in the family who slowed down long enough to really look at things. The label did not know any of that. The label only knew what it had been told, which was a category. Dot heard Clifford before she saw him. His voice came from the study where he kept the files and the investment folders and the statements he had always handled himself. Not because she had asked him to, but because early in their marriage he had begun doing it. And she had allowed the habit to form the way you allow any habit to form through repetition and the daily confirmation that nothing appears to be going wrong. He was speaking quietly into his phone, not urgently. Not the way a man speaks when he is trying to stop something, the way a man speaks when he is confirming arrangements. The measured cadence of someone who has made decisions and is now executing them. When the call ended, he came to the study doorway and looked at her. 40 years of marriage had given Dot a thorough knowledge of Clifford Marsh in the way that long proximity gives you knowledge of anything. Not always accurate, not always fully conscious, but present in the body in a way that words come slower than sensation. She knew his footstep on a staircase. She knew the particular silence before he said something he had rehearsed. She knew the face he wore when he had already decided and was waiting for her to arrive at the same place. He was wearing that face now. He told her about the investments first. He used the word complicated more than once, as though the situation were a thing that had grown beyond anyone's particular intention, rather than a series of decisions made by a specific person in a specific sequence over a specific period of time. He told her the accounts had been overstretched for longer than she knew. He told her the condo association had been notified. He told her the notices had come, which was a phrase that suggested they had arrived without invitation, rather than as the predictable consequence of what had preceded them. Each sentence was spoken with the careful evenness of a man who has practiced not sounding like what he is. Dot listened. She stood in her own dining room beside her mother's auction-labeled bowl, and she listened to her husband explain why strangers were packing her life into boxes on a Tuesday afternoon. She had questions. She was a woman who had always had questions, who had believed in the practical value of information gathered directly, rather than assumed, who had spent 40 years in a marriage that had asked her slowly, and without any single dramatic moment to ask fewer of them. She thought about the study, the locked filing cabinet she had not opened in 12 years, because he said it would only worry her. The credit card statements she had stopped reviewing because he said he had it handled. The investment summaries she had stopped requesting because asking for them seemed like a statement about trust rather than a question about money. She had trusted, not because she was foolish, because trust after enough years starts to feel the same as knowing. Then one of the movers came from the bedroom. He was young and broad-shouldered, and he was carrying something against his side the way you carry something you have been told is fragile. The wooden box. Dot crossed the room before she understood she was moving. She took it from his hands with both of hers. He looked startled, then stepped back the way people step back from a certainty of feeling they were not prepared to encounter. The box was her father's. Earl Caulfield had made it himself in the back room of the diner in Harlan County on winter evenings when the last customers had gone and the kitchen was being cleaned, and he had time for the small carpentry projects he kept to himself. Dot had seen it her whole childhood on the shelf above his desk in the diner office, a plain wooden box, stained dark with a brass clasp and a fit so tight that opening the lid required a specific technique, a slight twist before the lift, the way it had always been done. She knew the technique without thinking about it, the way she knew other things she had learned as a child in the body, rather than the mind. She opened the box. Inside was the keychain. She had seen it 1,000 times. A worn leather tag stamped with her father's initials, E. Caulfield. The letters faded now to something barely legible. 2 keys she recognized immediately. The farmhouse key, heavy and old, the kind made when keys were made to last. The diner key, smaller with the particular worn shine of something handled daily for decades. And a third key she had always been peripherally aware of without ever paying it direct attention. Small. Brass. Distinctly different from the others in the way that things are different when they belong to a different category of purpose. She had never wondered about it before. She wondered about it now. She closed her hand around the keychain and looked up at Clifford. He had come farther into the room. He was not far from her. And he was looking at the keychain in her hand with an expression she had not seen from him before, and would spend the next several days trying to name. It was not guilt. It was not embarrassment. It was something more precise than either of those. It was the expression of a man who has accounted for most things and has encountered one he did not fully account for. That look told her something she had not known before that moment. He knew about the small brass key. She did not know what it opened, but he did. Dot closed her fingers around the keychain. She held it at her side. And then Clifford said the sentence that she would return to many times in the weeks ahead. Not because it was the cruelest thing he could have said, but because it was the most precise. It was the sentence of a man who understood exactly what he was doing, who had chosen his words the way you choose words when you want them to accomplish something specific. He said it gently. He said, "You always loved that old place better than anywhere else. The diner, the farmhouse, that was always where you belonged. Not an apology, not a confession, a relabeling. The same way the yellow label had been placed on her mother's bowl, he had placed a label on what he was doing. He had named her removal as her preference. He had taken the destination he had chosen for her and framed it as the place she had always been heading. She had heard him say difficult things before. She had heard him be wrong and refuse to admit it. She had heard him manage conversations the way he managed financial portfolios, with a calm that was not neutrality, but control, with a tidiness that left no room for anything messy to require attention. She had never heard him do this. She held the keychain and she thought about the files she had not seen, the statements she had not asked for, the calls he had taken in the other room, the dinner invitation he had declined 2 years ago before asking her which she had noticed, and then allowed herself to unnotice because noticing it would have required her to ask what it meant, and she had by then fallen into the long habit of not asking. She thought about her mother's bowl. She thought about her aunt's quilt. She thought about 40 years. She said nothing. That was the only power she had in that room at that moment, and she used it. She said nothing, and she turned and she walked to the bedroom where she and Clifford had slept for 22 years, and she packed what she could carry. She did not pack the photographs. She would understand this decision later in the car on the mountain road, after the city lights had thinned to nothing, and the highway had narrowed to 2 lanes with trees on both sides. She would understand that she had not packed the photographs, because the photographs were of a life she no longer had access to, and to carry them would be to look at them, and looking at them would cost her something she could not afford to spend on the road ahead. She would carry what she remembered instead. Memory was hers in a way that photographs could not be labeled and placed in a box. She packed 3 bags. She packed practically because she was a practical woman who had always packed for outcomes rather than feelings. Layers because Mountain October was not the October of the city. The first aid kit from under the bathroom sink because she had kept a first aid kit accessible for 40 years. And the habit was not something she was capable of abandoning even in the worst afternoon of her recent life. Some food from the pantry wrapped in cloth the way her mother had taught her. Clifford's knife, which had been Roy's knife, which had sat in the kitchen drawer for 30 years, and which she took without examining why. She took the wooden box. She took the keychain. She left everything that could be labeled. She did not say goodbye to Clifford, because there was nothing to say to him that the act of leaving did not already say more clearly. She walked through the dining room without looking at the bowl. She walked through the living room without looking at the stacked boxes. She walked out the door of the condominium, and she did not close it behind her because closing it felt like a period on a sentence she was not finished with yet. She drove south and then east and then south again, following the route she had not driven in years, but whose shape she still knew. The way you know the shape of things you learned before you knew you were learning them. The city fell away in layers, the expressway exits spacing further apart, the commercial signs giving way to the older, quieter language of small towns, church names and hardware stores and the particular combination of a diner and a motel that told you the community was small enough to need both in the same block. She did not turn on the radio. The only sound inside the car was the road under the tires and the soft wooden knock of the box on the passenger seat when she took a curve. She was aware of the box the way you are aware of something when its presence has suddenly acquired a weight it did not previously carry. Once near Corbin, she put her right hand on the box and left it there for the length of a straight stretch of highway. Not to open it, just to know it was still there. At a rest stop outside the county line, she pulled under a fluorescent light and sat without getting out and checked her phone. No message from Clifford, no call, no voicemail dressed as concern. Only the reminder from the assisted living center, automated and cheerful, about next week's visiting hours. She looked at the reminder for a long moment. That morning she had sat beside her sister's bed and rubbed lavender lotion into her sister's thin hands and promised to be back next week. And while she was doing that, movers had been inside her home sorting the things she had spent her life accumulating into 3 categories, one of which was a word that did not belong anywhere near anything she cared about. She set the phone down. She opened the wooden box. The keychain lay on top, the leather tag, and the 3 keys tangled together. The way they had always been tangled, the slight weight of them familiar in a way that was almost painful. Beneath the keychain there was a photograph she had not seen before, or had seen and not remembered, which was a different thing. It was a small photograph, the square format of an old instant camera. The colors shifted with age toward the warm amber that old photographs shift toward. In it, a girl of about 12 stood outside a building. She was wearing a yellow sweater. The sweater was too big for her in the way of sweaters worn by girls who have not finished growing into their shoulders yet. She was squinting slightly against the sun. Beside her stood a man with one hand resting on her shoulder, not gripping, just resting the way you rest a hand on something you are proud of without needing to hold it. Behind them, a sign read, Caulfield Family Diner. The sign was red. She had forgotten how red it had been. The kind of red that was visible from the road even in winter, even in rain. Her father was not looking at the camera. He was looking at her. She had forgotten that about him, that he looked at her the way he looked at things he believed in steadily, without needing anything back from them. She sat in the rest stop parking lot and held the photograph for a long time. Then she put it back, closed the box, and drove on. The highway became a 2-lane road, and then the 2-lane road became a mountain road, and the mountain road became the specific darkness of Harlan County after midnight, which was a darkness Dot had grown up inside and which she recognized in the body, the way she recognized the smell of the diner, the particular combination of coal dust and pine, and the particular cold of October air that had traveled down off the ridge. She turned onto the county road, trees on both sides, old mailboxes leaning toward the gravel shoulders. A church sign caught in the headlights and disappeared. A farmhouse set back from the road with one light on in a window, the yellow warmth of it faint and private against the dark. Then the property. She had not seen it in 3 years. The last time she had been here was for a different reason, to meet with the county tax assessor about the property status. A meeting she had driven 4 hours for, and then driven 4 hours back from the diner. Still padlocked the farmhouse. Still sheeted the weeds. Still advancing on the gravel lot, in the way that things advance when no one is maintaining a boundary. She slowed the car. Her headlights moved across the front of the Caulfield family diner. The sign was still there. The red was gone in patches, the paint flaking away in sections to reveal the weathered wood beneath. But the letters were still readable. The shape of it was the same shape she had known since she was old enough to know shapes. The parking lot was empty, the gravel weedy at the edges. The rusted pole near the entrance where truckers had once tied handwritten notes during snowstorms, still standing at its slight lean. She stopped the car and the headlights held on the front door. The door was not fully closed. She looked at it for a long moment. Not wide open, not the kind of open that announced itself. A hinge width of dark showing at the edge of the frame a thin line of shadow where the latch should have been engaged. The glass was intact. The frame showed no damage. The lock mechanism itself, what she could see of it from the car, appeared undamaged. Whoever had been inside had not broken in. They had a key, or they had known about the lock which her father had never quite fixed in the last years before the diner closed the latch. That did not always catch if you pulled the door to without pressing it firmly, the way you had to press it firmly, and hear the click before you let go. She had known that her whole life. Every person who had worked in the diner had known it. She turned off the engine. The silence was immediate and deep. The silence of a rural county road after midnight. No traffic, no machinery, only the wind on the ridge and the creak of the diner sign moving slightly on its single remaining bracket. She took her father's keychain from the box. She opened the car door. The gravel shifted under her shoes, the sound of it familiar in a way that went all the way down. The air smelled of damp grass and old wood, and the particular mineral smell of the creek that ran behind the property, the one that flooded every 3 or 4 years and deposited a particular gray silt on the lower edge of the parking lot that took weeks to dry. She could smell the approaching rain in the air, the pressure of it not yet arrived but building. She walked to the diner door. She pushed it with 2 fingers. The bell rang. She had not thought about the bell. It was a small brass bell above the door, the kind that diner doors had carried for 100 years, the kind whose sound she had heard so many thousands of times in her childhood that she had stopped hearing it as a distinct thing and had come to hear it as part of the fabric of the place itself, like the hum of the refrigerators or the sound of the coffee machine cycling. She had not stood in front of that door and heard that bell in 17 years. It traveled through the empty diner and came back from every wall. For a second, she was 12 years old. She was sitting in the corner booth with her homework on the table beside a plate of French fries, and her father was moving behind the counter pouring coffee for men with tired eyes and muddy boots. And her mother was calling orders through the kitchen window, and the bell was ringing every few minutes as someone came in or went out. Then the present returned. The diner was empty. The booths were dusty. The red vinyl cracked at the corners of every cushion. The counter was dulled from a decade and a half without attention. The stools sat with their chrome legs still upright, but their red seats worn down to something between pink and gray. The pie case behind the counter was empty except for a dead moth lying on its side in the far corner. Wings folded perfectly still. Dot stepped inside. She used her phone light. The beam moved slowly across the room, finding old menus still standing in their holders at the end of each table, finding the coffee machine with its cracked carafe, finding the salt shakers still standing in their pairs, as though no one had told them the diner had closed, and they had simply been waiting for the next meal to need them. The beam caught something on the counter. An envelope. It was yellow with age, the way paper yellows when it has been kept somewhere dry for a long time. But it was not dusty. Everything around it was dusty. The counter surface under it was dusty. But the envelope itself sat clean on the counter, as though it had been placed there recently, as though someone had set it down carefully and walked away. Her name was written across the front. Not Mrs. Marsh, not Dorothea, not even Dot Caulfield Marsh, which was the combined name she had used professionally since her marriage, the way some women of her generation kept both names as a practical matter of identity. Just Dot, one syllable, the name her father had called her from the time she was born, the shortened form of Dorothea, that had felt in his voice less like a nickname and more like a precise and affectionate observation, as though Dot were exactly what she was, a small point from which everything else oriented. The handwriting made her breath stop in her chest. She recognized it before she understood what she was recognizing. The shape of the letters, the particular forward lean of the capitals, the way the T was crossed with a short, flat stroke slightly below center. The way the period after Dot had been made not by a tap, but by a small, deliberate press that left a mark slightly larger than a period needed to be. Her father had been dead for 17 years. Dot stood behind the counter of the diner her father had built and looked at an envelope in his handwriting that was not covered in dust. She did not touch it immediately. She looked at it with the phone light steady, and her breath coming in the shallow way. Breath comes when the body is trying to be careful. And she thought about the door that had been hinge-width open when she arrived. She thought about the diner key on the keychain that could open this door. She thought about the small brass key she had never paid attention to before today, before Clifford looked at it, and his face had changed. She thought about who else might have a key to this diner. The diner key her father had kept. The copy that had been with the property manager for the first 5 years after the closing, before Dot had reclaimed it. The spare which she could not account for, which she could not remember the last time she had seen or thought about. Someone had been here. They had not come for shelter. The footprints in the dust made that clear. A single trail from the door to the counter and then continuing past the register toward the kitchen, deliberate and directed. They had come looking for something. Dot picked up the envelope. Her name in her father's handwriting in an envelope that was not dusty, sitting on a counter in a diner that had been closed for 15 years. She did not open it yet. She looked toward the swinging door that led to the kitchen, where the footprints continued. And she thought about the drawer in the kitchen that her father had kept locked for as long as she could remember. The one she had tried to open as a child and been gently stopped. The one he had smiled about and said, "Some things are not ready for children yet." The one she had not thought about in years, because she had not been in this kitchen in years. She thought about the small brass key on the keychain in her pocket. She thought about Clifford's face when he saw it. She pushed through the swinging door, and the smell changed immediately. Old grease and cold metal and dry wood. The smell of a commercial kitchen that had been standing still for a long time. The pans were still hanging on their hooks. The prep table still had its scarred surface, the cuts and burns of 30 years of daily use written into it. The big stove stood against the wall with the particular authority of something built to last and left standing long after its purpose ended. Near the pantry, beneath the narrow window that had always looked out on the back fence, was the drawer. It was the one she had tried to open as a child. It had a lock that she had never seen opened. Dot reached into her pocket and took out the small brass key and held it in the beam of her phone light and looked at it for a moment. Then she crossed the kitchen floor. She put the key in the lock. It turned. The drawer resisted at first, not because the lock was fighting her. The key had turned cleanly fully, the mechanism releasing with a precision that suggested it had been maintained even while everything around it aged and stiffened and gathered dust. The resistance was in the wood itself, the drawer swollen slightly in its frame from years of mountain humidity, cycling through the building with no climate control to manage it. The wood expanding and contracting with the seasons until the fit had become too tight for easy movement. Dot pulled with both hands. A dry wooden scrape, the sound of something that had not moved in a long time, being asked to move. Then the drawer came free. She held the phone light over it. 3 notebooks, thick ones, the kind with cardboard covers and sewn bindings, the kind that were made to last rather than to be discarded. They were tied together with kitchen twine, the same white cotton twine her father had kept on a wooden spool near the register for tying up packages when customers ordered pie to go. The twine had yellowed with the notebooks, which had yellowed with the years, but the knot was still firm, and the notebooks were still intact. No cash, no legal documents, no deed or will or the kind of official paper that a person in Dot's situation, 3 bags in the back seat of a car, and a husband who had just dismantled her life, might have been hoping to find. Just notebooks. She almost laughed, not because anything was funny, because after everything that had happened in the past 12 hours, the particular absurdity of standing in a dark kitchen in a closed diner at 1 in the morning and finding nothing but notebooks felt like the kind of joke that life makes when it wants to remind you that the things you actually need are never the things you think you are looking for. She carried the notebooks and the envelope back through the swinging door and sat at the counter on one of the cracked red stools and untied the twine. She opened the first notebook. Her father's handwriting filled every page. The top of the first page said, "Chicken stew," followed by a list of ingredients in his careful block letters. The measurements precise the way he had always been precise about the things he cared about. She recognized the recipe immediately, not from reading it, but from the smell memory that the words activated the particular combination of carrots and onion and bay leaf and the splash of something he never told anyone about. The ingredient that made his stew taste different from every other chicken stew she had ever eaten, and that she had never been able to successfully replicate in her own kitchen, because she had never known what it was. She read the recipe. Then she saw the margin. Beside the stew recipe, in the same handwriting but smaller, tucked into the white space between the printed lines, her father had written a note. Miller family. No charge. Flood took the basement. She stared at it. Then she turned the page. Buttermilk biscuits. And in the margin beside the recipe, another note. Helen came back again. Husband laid off 2 months now. Sent extra home with her. She turned another page. Apple butter. In the margin, Dawson family. 4 meals this week. Did not ask. Just brought the kids. Dot put the notebook down on the counter and pressed her hands flat against the surface and breathed. She had come here expecting the locked drawer to hold something she could use, something practical. An account number, a property document, a piece of paper that gave her a legal position or a financial foothold. or some concrete thing that she could carry out of this diner and convert into a next step. What she had found was a record, not of money, not of assets, a record of people. She picked up the notebook again and turned pages slowly, and with each page, the same pattern revealed itself. Recipes on the right side, precise and complete, the kind of recipes that could be followed by someone who had never made the dish before and trusted the measurements. And in the margins, running alongside the ingredients and techniques and times, a parallel record written smaller, written as though it were incidental, as though her father were making notes to himself about things that did not fit anywhere else. The Whitaker boy ate 3 plates, did not charge. Looked like he had not eaten since Monday. Ruth Ann stopped by on the way back from the hospital. Coffee and pie, no charge. She was alone. Road closed 3 days. 8 men sleeping in their trucks out back. Kept coffee on all night. Dot read for a long time. She read with the phone light and the stillness of the empty diner around her, and the occasional small sounds of the building adjusting to the October cold. The particular creaks and settlings of an old structure that has been standing through many seasons and carries the memory of them in its joints. The notebooks were not just recipes. They were a record of a decision her father had made and renewed every day for decades. The decision to keep the door open when someone needed it to be open, to keep the register closed when the math did not work in someone's favor, but the need was present anyway. To be the place that did not ask questions about why you were there or what you could pay. She had thought she understood her father. She had thought she knew him the way children know parents. They grew up close to from proximity and daily detail, and the accumulated small observations of a childhood spent in and around his workplace. She had thought she knew him. She had not known this. She had not known the scope of it. The second notebook was more of the same, different recipes, different names, different margins filled with the same quiet record. A family from up the hollow whose name she recognized as one that had once been associated with one of the coal operations that had closed in the early 90s. A woman who came every Tuesday and sat in the corner booth for 2 hours and ordered only coffee and was never presented with a bill. A group of men who showed up once during a bad winter and sat through the afternoon and were given soup and sent home with bags of day-old bread. In the second notebook, the notes became more detailed. Her father had started adding dates. He had started noting the season as though the season were relevant to the understanding of what the need was. He had started noting small follow-up observations. The Dawson children looked better this week. Helen's husband found work at the lumber yard. The Miller family's basement got cleared out, and they came in to say thank you, and tried to pay, did not let them. Did not let them. That phrase stopped Dot. She read it again. Her father had not only given meals to people who could not pay. He had refused payment when they tried to offer it. He had understood without needing to have it explained to him that the accepting of money from someone who had come to him in difficulty was a different kind of transaction from the refusing of it. And he had chosen the version that did not ask anything in return. Dot sat with the second notebook in her hands and thought about her father coming home late. The smell of him when he came in, coffee and grease and wood smoke. The way he would sit at the kitchen table for a while before coming to bed. The way she had sometimes heard him there, when she woke in the night. The particular creak of the kitchen chair that told her where he was. She had thought he was tired. She had thought he was the kind of tired that came from physical work, from standing all day and carrying things and managing a kitchen. She had not understood that he was also carrying the weight of what the notebooks described. The daily calculation of what the diner could absorb without failing, what it could give without running dry, the constant quiet management of a place that was doing more than the sign outside said it was doing. She was still holding the second notebook when she heard the sound outside. Not a car. Not on the road. Something closer. The gravel of the parking lot. The particular slow shift of it, under weight, deliberate and unhurried. Dot turned on the phone screen, killing the flashlight app, and the interior of the diner went dark. She sat very still. Through the front windows, she could see the parking lot, the pale gravel and the dark weeds at its edges, and her car sitting where she had parked it, and beyond the car, the county road and the tree line. And across the road, a light, a porch light coming on in the house directly opposite the diner. She had known that house her whole childhood. It had been the Dunning house for as long as she could remember. The white clapboard two-story with the old rose bush along the front fence that Vera Dunning had planted in the first year of her marriage and tended for 50 years and refused to let anyone near with pruning shears. The porch light was on, and behind the front window curtain there was a shadow, a person standing at the window looking out. Dot watched the shadow for a long moment. Then she turned the phone flashlight back on and found the envelope on the counter and picked it up. She opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The same forward-leaning handwriting. The same short crossing of the T. Dot, the letter began. If you are reading this, the diner has called you back before you were ready. That was always going to be the way it happened. The things worth coming back to never wait for the right time. They only wait for the time you have. Don't trust the first story people tell you about why this place closed. The first story is always the easy one. The easy one is that business slowed down, and the road changed and the time had come. That story is not wrong exactly. It is just not all the way true. Start with the notebooks in the drawer. Read all 3 of them. Read the margins. Then go across the road and ask Vera Dunning what happened the winter before I closed. She was there for all of it. She has kept something for you. I am sorry I did not tell you this while I was alive. I told myself I was protecting you from something that would make your marriage harder, and maybe that was true. But I also know I was a man who found it easier to leave things in drawers than to say them out loud. You were always the one who noticed things. I used to watch you in the diner when you were small. The way you would look at the room, really look at it when everyone else was just moving through it. I thought about that for years. I thought if anything ever happens to this place, Dot will be the one to understand it. She will know what it was for. The diner was never just a diner. Your father. Dot read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully along its original creases and placed it inside her coat against her chest, where she could feel it without thinking about it. She locked the diner behind her, pressing the door firmly, until she heard the catch engage, and she crossed the parking lot to her car and sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine and looked at the porch light across the road. The shadow was still there. Dot looked at it for a long time. Then she took the notebooks and the envelope inside the farmhouse and spread them on the kitchen table under the overhead light she found. After trying 3 switches, and she made herself as comfortable as she could on a kitchen chair, with the coat still on, and she read. She read until the light changed outside the windows, and the birds started in the trees behind the property, and the October morning came in gray and cold and specific, with the smell of rain that had not fallen yet, but was coming. She had read all 3 notebooks by the time the sun was fully up. She sat at the table and did not move for a while. The 3rd notebook was different from the first 2 in a way that she had felt building as she turned the pages. The recipes were the same, her father's precise measurements, his careful instructions. But the margin notes had changed in the 3rd notebook. They were shorter, more clipped. The dates were more specific, not just the month, but the day. The names were familiar to her now, people who had appeared in the first two notebooks and were reappearing here. And the notes about them had a different quality, the quality of worry rather than simple record. Helen's husband lost the lumber job, not doing well. Came in 3 times this week. Miller boys looking thin again. Road's still bad, can't get to the store. And then, toward the end of the third notebook, a cluster of entries with dates that clustered in a single winter written in a hand that was slightly less steady than the earlier entries, as though the person writing them was tired in a way that showed in the writing. She had not known her father's handwriting could show tiredness. She put the third notebook face down on the table and stood up and went to the front window of the farmhouse and looked across the yard to the road. The porch light was off, but the curtain in the front window of the Dunning house moved slightly as she stood there, and then was still. Dot put on her shoes and crossed the road. Vera Dunning answered the door before Dot's second knock, which meant she had been watching the window. She was 76 years old, and smaller than Dot remembered, the way people are smaller than you remember when you have not seen them in years, and your memory has preserved them at their full adult authority, rather than the slightly diminished version that time produces. But her eyes were the same, sharp and present and assessing in the way of a woman who has spent decades paying close attention to things happening across the road. She did not seem surprised. She looked at Dot, the way you look at something you have been expecting for a long time, with the particular settled attention of a person who has prepared for a moment and is now simply in it. "Come in," she said. Vera's kitchen smelled of lemon oil and old paper. The table was small and the chairs were practical, and the shelves along one wall held the particular mixture of everyday items and carefully kept things that distinguished the kitchen of a woman who had never confused sentiment with disorder. Everything was placed with purpose. Vera moved to a narrow cabinet beside the stove that had a simple lock, the kind with a small key that lived in the lock itself, and she opened it. She brought out a metal tin. The lid was blue, faded, with a painted design of snowflakes around the edge that had been bright once and was now only an impression of what it had been. She carried it to the table and set it in front of Dot and sat down across from her with her hands folded. "Your father asked me to keep that," Vera said. "After that winter." Dot looked at the tin and then at Vera. "He asked you." "He came across the road one afternoon in the spring," Vera said. "Brought coffee in a thermos the way he always did. Sat at this table. And he said, 'Vera, I need someone to hold on to something for me, in case Dorothy ever comes back here and needs to understand what happened.' He called her Dorothy. Her full name, the one almost no one used. Why didn't he just tell me?" Dot said. Vera looked at her steadily. "Because you were already married to that man by then," she said. "And your father was not sure that man would want you to know." The tin held index cards and folded receipts and handwritten notes on small pieces of paper, some torn from the edges of larger sheets, some written on the backs of things. A grocery receipt, a utility statement, a diner supply invoice. There were names on all of them. Families she recognized from the notebooks. Dates. Amounts mostly small, some marked paid, many not marked at all. And other things, clippings from the county newspaper, that she had not seen before, folded and placed carefully among the cards. She picked up one clipping. The headline was faded but still readable: "Local diner owner refuses development offer as highway project advances." She looked at Vera. Vera said, "Read it." She read it. The article was short, the kind of brief community news item that local papers ran when something had happened that did not quite rise to the level of a feature, but was part of the public record. A development company. She could not read the full name in the condition the clipping was in, but could make out Ridgecrest in the text. had made offers on several properties along the county road in connection with an expansion project tied to a proposed highway rerouting. Several property owners had accepted. Earl Caulfield, owner of the Caulfield Family Diner, had declined. There was a follow-up clipping more recent than the first by several months. This one was shorter. It said only that the highway rerouting project had been indefinitely postponed. It did not say what had happened to the offers that had already been accepted. Dot set the clippings down. Vera said the offer came with a condition. She said it plainly without emphasis in the way of a woman who has been keeping a version of this story for a long time and is grateful to finally give it to the person it belongs to. What condition? Dot said. The diner had to close before winter ended, Vera said. They needed the property clear by a specific date. Said it was a construction timeline issue. Said the diner was in the path of what they were planning. The diner was in the way. Vera looked at her. That was the word they used, she said. In the way. Dot thought about the notebooks, the cluster of entries in the last winter, the slightly unsteady handwriting, the names she recognized. She thought about what it would have meant for those people if the diner had closed in the middle of that winter. Not just the loss of a business, the loss of the one place that did not ask questions, the one place that kept the coffee on and the booth open and the register quiet when the register needed to be quiet. She said, and my father refused. He told them the diner would close when he decided it was time, Vera said. He told them his customers were in the middle of a hard winter and he was not going to put a lock on the door because someone with money needed his parking lot. Vera reached into the tin again and found an envelope. White, not yellowed like the one Dot had found in the diner. New enough that the paper still had some stiffness to it. This came last month, Vera said. She held it out. The name on the front was typed. Mrs. Caulfield Marsh. Dot opened it. Inside was a letter from Ridgecrest Development. Professional letterhead, clean print, the language of a company that communicated through lawyers and used words that sounded like courtesy while meaning something else. They were interested in the property on County Road 8, the letter said. They understood the estate had been in flux. They were prepared to offer a figure for the farmhouse and diner and surrounding land, and the figure they named was larger than Dot had expected, large enough to be useful, large enough to solve problems, large enough to be in the circumstances of a woman who had left a city apartment with 3 bags and no plan, something close to a lifeline. She read the second page. The buyer wanted full rights to the property, including the diner building and the farmhouse. The sale would be contingent on demolition clearance being obtained prior to closing. Buyer intended to raise existing structures to accommodate new development. Demolition. Dot looked out Vera's kitchen window at the diner across the road. The faded sign. The cracked front steps. The small brass bell above the door that she had heard ring at 1 in the morning and that had carried her back 40 years in the space between one breath and the next. Vera said that money would make sense to almost anyone. Dot did not answer. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. She pressed play on the voicemail. A woman's voice, polished and practiced, the voice of someone who makes calls like this regularly and has learned to sound like she is offering something when she is actually doing something else. Mrs. Marsh, this is Sharon Holt with Ridgecrest Development. We understand there may be some new urgency regarding the property on County Road 8. We would like to speak with you before other complications arise regarding the estate. Please call us at your earliest convenience. Mrs. Marsh. Not Mrs. Caulfield Marsh. Not even Dot. Missy R. Marsh. The name Clifford had given her. Dot set the phone on Vera's table very carefully, the way you set something down, when you do not want the force of putting it down to communicate more than you intend. New urgency, she said. Vera's eyes narrowed. She had been watching Dot's face while the voicemail played. They knew you were coming, Vera said. Before you knew you were coming. The two women sat with that for a moment. Dot thought about Clifford's face when he saw the keychain. The specific quality of recognition she had identified, but not been able to name. She thought about the sentence he had said, gentle and precise. The sentence that had sent her here. She thought about how exactly right it had been as a destination. For a woman who was being removed from one life and needed somewhere to land. She thought about how well it served someone else's purposes, if that somewhere happened to have a value that the woman did not yet understand. She stood up. She thanked Vera. She walked back across the road with the Ridgecrest letter in one hand and the third notebook under her arm, and stood in the parking lot of the diner in the October morning and looked at the building and thought about what it was and what it had been and what someone wanted to turn it into. Inside the farmhouse, she spread everything on the kitchen table. The 3 notebooks, Vera's tin of cards, the Ridgecrest letter, the inspector's list she would receive 3 days later, but was already beginning to anticipate. She did not have a plan yet. A plan was what you had when you knew what you were doing, and she did not know yet. What she had was the material of understanding. That afternoon, she walked through the diner in daylight for the first time since she had arrived. The daylight was different from the phone flashlight. It showed her things the flashlight had kept partial. The water stain on the ceiling near the back booth. The way the linoleum floor had worn through to the subfloor near the counter. In the places where people had stood most often, the particular testimony of accumulated daily presence. The booth by the window, the corner one where she had done homework as a child, and where she now saw in the daylight that the seat had a slightly different quality of wear from the other booths. The vinyl cracked in the pattern of frequent long occupation, rather than the pattern of people sitting briefly and leaving. That booth had been used more than the others. She thought about her father's notebooks. The booth kept open during storms. The one where people sat when they needed to sit without being asked why. She stood at the counter. She looked at the space. The equipment was old but intact. The stove was a commercial model that had been built to last and had lasted. And she had spent enough time in kitchens to know the difference between equipment that was done and equipment that needed attention. The refrigerators had been off for years, but the units themselves looked sound. The plumbing would need assessment. The wiring would need review. She did not let herself think about what any of this would cost. She thought instead about what her father had left in that drawer. Not money. Not a deed that superseded something. Not any kind of legal protection that could be produced in a meeting with a lawyer. Recipes. And beside the recipes, a record of why the recipes mattered. She went back to the farmhouse and she found a clean sheet of paper in the desk in the small front room where her father had kept his household files. And she wrote one sentence across the top of it. Community supper to benefit Caulfield. Family diner repairs. She wrote the day. Saturday. She wrote the time. She wrote 4 words that she knew from her father's notebooks were the right 4 words for this situation. Pay what you can. She walked back to the diner, and she taped the paper inside the front window, where it could be seen from the road. She stood back and looked at it. Her handwriting through the glass. The 4 words visible to the road. Her hands were not steady. She noticed this and did not try to stop it. She let them be unsteady. The paper was taped to the glass, and she was not going to take it down. Across the road, Vera's porch light came on. Then 3 houses further down, another light, a porch light she did not recognize, but which meant someone had seen the sign and was marking it in the way that people in small communities mark things that are being watched with light. Then, further down another. Dot stood in the parking lot of her father's diner with the October cold coming down off the ridge and 3 lights on across the road, and thought about the notebooks on the farmhouse table. The hundreds of names, the margins full of the quiet evidence of what this place had been. Her phone rang. She did not recognize the number, but she answered it. A woman's voice, older, slightly rough with age, and something that might have been the effort of calling someone she had not called in years. "I saw the sign," the woman said. "I used to work the morning shift for your daddy. I know where he kept the spare napkins. I know where the sugar delivery went when the pantry was full." She paused. "I haven't tied an apron in 6 years. And I don't know how my knees are going to feel about standing on that floor. But if you're doing this, I'm coming." Her name was Nadine Rucker. And Dot said, "Come Saturday. Come early." She stayed on the road after the call ended. She looked at the sign she had taped in the window. She looked at the lights across the road. She thought about what her father had written in the letter he had left in an envelope on the diner counter for 17 years. The diner was never just a diner. She put her phone in her pocket and went back inside the farmhouse and sat down at the kitchen table, with the notebooks open in front of her, and the tin of cards beside them, and her father's letter on top of the pile. And she began to read the 3rd notebook again. This time from the beginning. This time slowly. This time with the understanding that she was not reading recipes. She was reading her inheritance. By Thursday, Dot knew what the diner needed. Not in the abstract, hopeful way she had known it when she taped the sign to the window. In the specific, enumerated, priced way that came from 2 days of walking through the building with a flashlight and a notepad, and the particular attention of a woman who had learned at 67 that wishful thinking was a luxury she could no longer afford. The wiring needed a licensed electrician, not a patch or review of the entire panel, and the runs to the kitchen equipment, because the original installation was older than her marriage, and the code had changed several times since then in ways that mattered. The water heater was at the end of its service life, possibly past it. The back steps had rotted at the base of 3 risers, and the railing was loose in a way that was not cosmetic but structural, the kind of loose that sent people to hospitals. The restroom required new fixtures and a working exhaust vent. The kitchen needed a fire suppression certification before any commercial use could be resumed. The county inspector had come on Wednesday with his clipboard, and his careful politeness and his apologetic eyes that kept moving from the list he was writing to her face, as though monitoring how much she could absorb at once. "I am not saying it cannot be done," he had said more than once. She had thanked him for that sincerely, because she understood that he had not needed to say it, and had said it anyway. But between his not saying it cannot be done and it being done was the matter of money. She did not have time she was running short on, and a development company that had already made one offer, and had not yet accepted that the answer was no. On Thursday evening, Dot sat at the farmhouse kitchen table with the repair list on her left and the Ridgecrest offer on her right. And she looked at them the way you look at 2 things that are pretending to be opposites, when they are actually 2 expressions of the same question. The question was not whether to sell. The question was whether she believed the diner was worth saving. She looked at the notebooks on the table, the 3 of them, their spines worn, their covers soft with handling. She thought about all the names in the margins. She thought about the people who had been kept warm and fed and dignified by a man who had understood something about what a place could be when it decided to be more than its business purpose. She thought about what would be in this county if the diner had closed the winter her father was pressured to close it. Not a building, not a sign, not a counter with cracked stools. The absence of a room where no one asked questions. The absence of a booth kept empty for whoever the next storm produced. She picked up the repair list and folded it and put it in her coat pocket. She left the Ridgecrest offer on the table. Saturday morning arrived cold and gray, the sky making no promises, a fine mist in the air that was not quite rain and not quite nothing. Dot had been up since 4:30. She had driven to the hardware store in Harlan the day before and bought the cleaning supplies she could afford. And she had spent Thursday and Friday cleaning the diner with the systematic thoroughness of a woman who had decided that a clean place was a declaration of intent before it was anything else. The floors were swept and mopped twice. The counter had been wiped down until the surface that had been under the dust turned out to be a warm, honey-colored wood laminate that she had not remembered being. That color had assumed was some darker shade, and which now ran the length of the counter with the quiet dignity of something that had been good all along, and only needed the years removed from it. The booths had been wiped down. The cracked vinyl cleaned the tables leveled where they had wobbled and resettled. She had not touched the corner booth by the window. She had stood at it and looked at it, and then she had moved on to the next one, and she had understood when she did it, why she had done it. That booth was not hers to restore. That booth had always belonged to whoever needed it. Nadine Rucker arrived at 8 in the morning with a canvas bag over one shoulder and both hands free, the way a woman arrives when she has been doing a job for long enough that she knows what she will need and knows her hands will need to be available for it. She was 73 years old, and she stood in the diner doorway for a moment after coming through and looked at the room the way you look at something you have known in a different version, measuring the distance between memory and present. Then she walked to the counter and opened the cabinet below the register. Extra napkins, she said. Still there. She said it to herself as much as to Dot, the quiet confirmation of a woman verifying her own memory. They worked together for the next 4 hours without needing to talk much. Dot had cooked the chicken stew the night before, following her father's recipe, exactly adding the 2 extra handfuls of carrots the margin note had specified for hard days, which felt relevant. The pot was large enough that she had used the biggest one from the farmhouse kitchen and had to carry it across the yard that morning with both hands and 2 stops to rest. The biscuits she made fresh that morning in the diner kitchen, which required coaxing the old stove through its first use in 15 years standing over it, while the pilot took 3 attempts to catch, and then adjusting the oven temperature twice, because the thermostat read warmer than it ran. She had been baking biscuits in ovens that did not behave correctly for 40 years. She managed. Nadine found the good coffee pot in the back of the storage room a larger capacity, one that her father had used for the morning rush, and she cleaned it and ran the first pot through twice before she was satisfied with what came out. By 4 in the afternoon, the diner smelled like itself. Not like the diner it currently was, dusty and time-stopped and waiting. Like the diner it had been. The particular combination of coffee and butter and something savory on the stove, and old wood warmed by use. The smell that she had carried in some deep register of her memory for 40 years without knowing she was carrying it, which had returned now with the sudden completeness of things that had never actually left. She stood behind the counter at 4:15 and looked at the room. The sign in the window, "Pay what you can." The 5 words visible from the road. The tables she had set not formally, not with the deliberate elegance of a restaurant, trying to impress, but practically with the clean and straightforward setting of a place that expected people to come and wanted them to find what they needed when they arrived. Paper napkins folded into rectangles. Mismatched cups she had found in the kitchen cabinet that held the clean dishware cups. From different decades, a white mug, with a handle that was slightly different from the others. A green ceramic mug that she did not recognize as having been in the diner when she was a child, and that had presumably appeared at some point without being accounted for in any record. Her father would have kept it. He would have put it in the cabinet and let it be used. She kept it. Vera Dunning arrived at 4:30, which was earlier than the sign said, and Dot did not comment on this. Vera sat in the first booth, the one nearest the counter, and put both hands around a coffee cup and looked at the room with the expression of a woman who has been waiting for something to happen and is now watching it happen and is not going to say anything sentimental about it because sentimentality had never been Vera's style. Nadine tied her apron. It was a faded thing, the kind of apron that diner waitresses wore white once, and now the color of something that had been washed many hundreds of times. She had brought it from home, had apparently kept it for 6 years since she had last worn it, had folded it, and kept it the way you keep things you are not ready to call finished. She tied it and straightened it and looked at the knot, and then she looked at Dot. "Your daddy kept the coffee on before anyone came in," she said. So there was always a smell when the door opened. Dot turned to the coffee machine. At 5 o'clock, the first car turned into the parking lot. She watched it from behind the counter, her hands resting on the surface that had cleaned up to honey-colored her breath, doing the thing it did when she was waiting for something she was not certain would arrive. The car was a Ford pickup dented on the passenger side in the way of trucks that have been working trucks rather than weekend trucks. A man got out. He was in his 60s, wearing a canvas jacket, and he walked toward the diner door with the particular gait of someone who is not certain what he will find inside, but has decided to come anyway. The bell rang when he opened the door. He stopped. He stood in the doorway and the bell sound moved through the room, and Dot watched him receive it, the way you watch someone receive a sound they did not know they had been waiting to hear. He stood there for a moment that was slightly longer than the situation required, and then he came in and sat at the counter. The second car came before he had his coffee. Then 3 more in quick succession, pulling into the gravel lot, the way cars pulled in when people had already decided and did not need to circle the block to confirm the decision. A woman carrying a foil-covered tray. 2 men in work boots who came in together and looked at the booths and chose the one in the middle, not the corner, not the front. The middle, the one that people chose when they wanted to be part of a room without being conspicuous in it. An older woman with a cane who came through the door slowly and looked around and then said out loud, to no one in particular, "Your daddy kept good coffee." Nadine said, "Still does." The woman sat down. By 6 o'clock, the counter was full and most of the booths were occupied, and the parking lot had cars along both sides of the gravel drive, parked the way people park, when a lot was not designed for this many cars, but everyone has made the adjustments required to make it work. Dot moved between the kitchen and the counter in a rhythm that Nadine had established, and that Dot had fallen into, not because Nadine had directed her, but because the rhythm of the space reasserted itself the way the rhythms of well-made spaces reassert themselves when they are in use again. Someone had brought a plate of deviled eggs. Someone had brought a pan of cornbread. These went on the end of the counter, and people helped themselves in the way that people help themselves to food at gatherings where the point is not the transaction, but the gathering. The donation box was a shoebox Dot had found in the farmhouse, recovered in the kitchen drawer paper. The way shoeboxes were sometimes recovered when they were repurposed as storage. Her father's handwriting on a label on the side that said, "Receipts 1987. She had set it at the end of the counter with a cut in the top, and the word donations written on a piece of diner notepad paper and taped to the front. She did not watch it. She had promised herself she would not watch it because watching it felt like a different kind of thing from what this evening was for. She ladled stew. She poured coffee. She said the name of the dish when people asked, and she told them the recipe was her father's. When they said it tasted like something they remembered, and she let them make the connections they were making without directing them. A man in his 60s, a trucker cap sitting at the counter with his elbows in the comfortable position of someone who had sat at counters. His whole life looked at the menu board that Dot had written on the old chalkboard in the morning and said he had not seen chicken stew on that board since he was 26 years old. "How did you know to come back?" he asked. "The sign," Dot said. "In the window." He shook his head slightly, not disagreeing. "Something else. I drove past this building twice a year for 15 years, he said. Every time I thought someone ought to do something about that." He looked at the bowl in front of him. He did not say anything else. A woman came through the door at 6:30 with a photograph in her hand, holding it carefully by the edges the way people hold photographs they have been protecting from damage. She went to the counter and waited until Dot was nearby. She held out the photograph. "My daddy and your daddy," she said, "after the big snow of '89. They cleared the road together with a borrowed plow." She pointed at two men standing in front of the diner door, both of them covered in snow to the thigh, both of them looking like men who have just accomplished something and are taking a moment to recognize it before moving on. Dot looked at her father in the photograph, covered in snow and grinning. She had not seen this photograph before. "I thought you should have it," the woman said. "I made a copy." Dot thanked her. She put the photograph on the shelf below the counter, face up where she could see it. By 7 o'clock, she had stopped moving long enough to check the donation box. And then she set it back on the counter and did not check it again because the first check had told her more than she had allowed herself to hope for. There were folded bills. There were checks. There were pieces of paper with writing on them that she did not read until later, but that she would read many times after the notes that people had folded into the box alongside the money. The small written testimony of what this place had been to them or to someone they had loved. She would read them later. At 8 o'clock, a teenager near the front booth held up a phone and filmed something, and she saw it happening and did not try to stop it, because she understood by then that the filming was not something being done at the expense of the evening, but as an extension of it, as the way that things spread now. And when she saw the screen, she could see that the comments were coming in from people who were not in the diner, but who were watching, and that some of them were saying they were on their way. By 8:30, the stew was nearly gone. By 9, the parking lot held cars she did not recognize. Nadine called out orders from the window between the kitchen and the counter, the way the kitchen window at the Caulfield family diner had always worked. The orders moving from the room to the kitchen, in the particular shorthand of a place where the people on both sides of the window knew the menu and each other well enough to speak in abbreviations. When the stew ran out, Nadine appeared in the window. She held up both hands, palms out, a gesture that needed no translation. Dot looked at the room. People were still at their tables. No one moved to leave. The coffee machine continued its slow work. The conversation in the room had the quality that good conversation has, when it is not being performed for anyone but is simply happening because the conditions are right for it. She heard the car before she saw it, not because it was loud, because the parking lot had a particular sound when a car entered it. The crunch of the gravel, a specific combination of tire width and speed, and this car entered it at a speed that was not the speed of someone arriving for supper. It was the speed of someone who had not planned to come but had decided to and was trying not to give themselves time to reconsider. Headlights swept across the front windows. The room noticed without reacting the particular collective awareness of a gathering that has been a closed and comfortable thing and has just admitted the possibility of something from outside. The door opened. Sharon Holt, dark coat heels that had sunk slightly into the gravel of the parking lot, so that when she stepped inside, there was a small trace of gravel dust on the toe of one shoe, the evidence of a world that was not designed for the kind of shoe she was wearing. She looked around the room with the assessing gaze of a professional who has been trained to evaluate spaces and their contents for purposes other than enjoyment. She saw the donation box. She saw the notes on the wall where people had begun to pin things, photographs, and slips of paper, the accumulating record of an evening. She saw Dot behind the counter. She smiled in the way that people smile when they have been sent to do something and intend to do it regardless of the atmosphere of the room. "Mrs. Marsh," she said. "I hope I am not interrupting." Her voice was designed to sound like it hoped no such thing. The room had gone quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something enters that changes the temperature. Sharon came to the counter and set a folder on it. The Ridgecrest folder, its letterhead visible at the top of the document inside. She placed one hand on the folder and leaned slightly toward Dot in the posture of a conversation that is meant to appear intimate, but is actually a form of pressure. She said, "I understand this is meaningful." She said it with the careful emphasis of a word that is being used as a category, the category of things that are meaningful but not practical. Things that have value in a certain register, but not in the register that matters most to the people she worked for. She said, "But you need to think clearly about your position." She began to outline the position, the repairs the county required, the financial situation that had brought Dot here in the first place, the complications around the estate, the timeline of the offer, which she said with a gentle regret in her voice would not extend indefinitely. She pushed the folder an inch closer to Dot. "Consider this carefully," she said. "Before emotion makes a decision that practicality will have to live with." Dot looked at the folder. She did not touch it. She thought about the notebooks on the farmhouse table, the margins, the 346 names she had counted in her third reading of the third notebook, a count she had done without planning to count, and had found herself doing at 2 a.m. with a pencil, making small marks at the top of each page. She thought about the letter in her coat pocket. She thought about the booth in the corner by the window, which had been kept empty tonight. As she had kept it empty, not by plan, but by the same instinct her father had followed the booth that Vera had told her about, the one reserved for no one, and therefore for anyone. She thought about the photograph below the counter, 2 men covered in snow grinning. The door opened again. The bell rang. Clifford Marsh stood in the entrance. The room registered him the way a room registers something that has arrived from the wrong direction. A slight collective, stilling the breathing of a gathering that has just understood that something has changed. He was wearing the coat from Louisville, the good one, but it was wrinkled in a way it would not have been 3 days ago. His hair was not quite right. He looked smaller than the version of him that had stood in the dining room of the condominium and watched strangers wrap her mother's bowl with professional efficiency. He looked at the room. He looked at Sharon Holt. And Sharon Holt looked at him. It was a short exchange, the kind of exchange between people who know each other and who are both calculating in the same half second whether this coincidence will be read correctly by the people watching it. It was read correctly. Vera saw it. Dot saw the moment Vera saw it. Nadine came to the kitchen window and looked through, and her expression told Dot that she had seen it too. Clifford came inside. The bell settled. He looked at Dot behind the counter, and he looked at the room, and he went through the adjustment that his face always went through when he encountered a situation he had not fully anticipated. The small recalibration that she had learned to recognize over 40 years as the moment between what he had planned and what he was now going to say instead. He said her name, just her name. Margaret, he had called her in their early years. Dot, the name her father used, which Clifford had taken up at some point, and then over time had used less frequently, the way certain intimate details of a person get set aside in a long marriage as the formality of habit overtakes the specificity of knowing. He said Dot now. She waited. He said there were things she might not understand. He said this carefully in the tone that she had heard him use in financial conversations when he was the one who had the information and she was the one who was supposed to receive it. He said the accounts were in worse condition than he had described. He said creditors were actively engaged. He said if she was not in a position to accept a reasonable offer on the property, there might be claims that neither of them would find comfortable. Neither of them. After everything. After the boxes in the hallway and the woman in her kitchen wrapping her mother's glasses and the label on the quilt and the keychain and the sentence that had sent her here. After all of that, he was still standing in her father's diner saying neither of them. Dot was already moving before she fully understood what she was doing. She took a clean bowl from the shelf behind the counter. She took the ladle and went to the pot, which still had a portion of stew at the bottom, the last of it. The portion she had been saving without knowing she had been saving it. She ladled it into the bowl. She put 2 biscuits on a plate beside it. She carried both to the counter and set them down in front of Clifford and stood back. He looked at the food. He looked at her. The room was very quiet. Dot said my father fed people who had nowhere else to go. He kept the door open when it was easier to close it. He turned down money when the money required him to stop being what this place was. She looked at Clifford for a moment. She said, I will not stop being his daughter because you forgot how to be decent. She let that stand in the room. Then she said, you can eat. And then you can go. Everything regarding the estate or any legal matters goes through my attorney, not through a conversation in my father's diner. She said it the way her father had written things in the margin of his notebooks, plainly, without theatrical emphasis, as the statement of something that had already been decided. She looked at Sharon Holt. Nadine appeared at the kitchen window. She reached through and took the Ridgecrest folder from the counter. She held it back out toward Sharon with the particular expression of a woman who has been managing people across a service counter for most of her working life and knows exactly when to hand something back. We are closing soon, Nadine said. There was a beat of silence. Then someone near the back of the room let out a soft sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else, just an exhalation. The room breathing again after holding its breath. Sharon Holt picked up the folder. She looked at the room one more time. The full booths, the notes pinned to the wall, the shoebox with its cut-in top, the photographs, the mismatched cups, the 2 women behind and at the counter who were not looking at her but were clearly finished with her. She adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder. She left. The bell rang above her on the way out. Clifford remained at the counter. He did not eat immediately. He sat for a moment with his hands in his lap, and he looked at the bowl and at the room and at Dot, who had moved back to her position behind the counter and was pouring coffee for a woman who had come in late and was sitting 2 stools down. The room resumed. Not loudly, not demonstratively, but with the particular return to itself that rooms accomplish when they have been interrupted and decided collectively to continue. Clifford picked up the spoon. He ate the stew. He ate slowly. Not like a man performing an action for an audience, but like a man who had not eaten today and was now being presented with something warm, and the warmth was getting into him, in the way that warmth gets into people who have been driving and not stopping and trying to reach something they are not certain they have the right to reach. He ate the biscuits. He drank the coffee that appeared at his elbow, placed there by Nadine without comment. When he was done, he sat for a moment with the empty bowl in front of him. He said the property is worth more than they are offering. He said it quietly. He said it toward the counter surface rather than toward Dot, and the tone of information being offered without the weight of it being requested. Dot looked at him. He said a geothermal study was done on the aquifer rights attached to the land 3 years ago, the water rights alone. He stopped. He looked at the bowl. He said you should have someone look at that before you sign anything. She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "Thank you." He put money on the counter. Not a gesture, not a negotiation. Money at the price of a meal placed under the edge of the bowl. He got up. He put on his coat. He walked to the door and he paused there for a moment with his hand not yet on the handle. He did not say anything. He went out into the night and the bell rang above him. She did not watch him cross the parking lot. She took his bowl and his cup to the kitchen, and she stood at the sink for a moment, and she let herself feel the full weight of the evening. Not the drama of the final hour, but the cumulative weight of all of it. The sign in the window and the phone call from Nadine, and the cars in the lot, and the woman with the photograph, and the man who said he had not seen chicken stew on that board since he was 26, and all the people in between, the whole long human fact of the evening. Then she washed the bowl and the cup and put them on the drain rack. She went back out front. The diner stayed open until 10. When the last customers left and the parking lot had emptied by degrees and the road outside had returned to the quiet of a rural county road. After its hours, Dot and Nadine and Vera sat at the counter with coffee cups and the donation shoebox between them. Dot opened the box. She sorted the money onto the counter. Bills and checks and coins and the folded pieces of paper with writing on them, which she set to the side. She added the amounts with the pencil she had behind her ear, the way her father had kept a pencil, the way her father's pencil had been behind his ear. In the photograph below the counter, the photograph of 2 snow-covered men grinning. The total was enough, not more than enough, not a comfort margin. Enough exactly for the electrical review and the water heater and the back steps and the kitchen certification, with a small amount left over. That was not enough for the restroom fixtures, but was a start toward them. Vera had her hands around her coffee cup and was watching Dot count. Nadine had taken off her apron and was folding it on the counter with the care of something being stored. Dot put the pencil down. She looked at the notes in the pile, the ones she had set aside. She picked up the first one. Someone had torn a piece from a brown paper bag and written on it in blocky, uneven letters, "For the booth where my uncle slept 3 nights after the bridge washed out. He talked about your daddy until the day he died." She read the next one. "For Ruth Ann, who drank free coffee here for 11 years and said it kept her going. She doesn't need it anymore, but we do." She read them all. There were 23 of them. When she finished, she held them in both hands and looked at Vera. Vera said, "Your father would say that is more than he deserved." Dot said he would be wrong. Vera almost smiled. She was not a woman who smiled often enough for almost to be a small thing. Almost was something. Nadine picked up her bag. She said the biscuits were good. She said it plainly as a professional assessment. She said the recipe is right, but the oven runs cold on the left side. Your daddy knew to put the sheet pan on the right. "I will remember that," Dot said. Nadine nodded. She walked to the door and the bell rang and she was gone. Vera finished her coffee and stood slowly. The careful rising of joints that have been sitting for a long time in October cold. She put her coat on at the counter. She said, before she left, "There is one more thing in the tin you should know about." Dot waited. "Vera said your father made inquiries with the county clerk the year before he died about the possibility of registering the diner as a historical property. The process was not complete. He ran out of time, but the application was started, and it was never formally withdrawn." She looked at Dot steadily. She said, "That means the application is still technically pending. And a pending application for historical registration complicates certain kinds of sale agreements in ways that a good attorney would know how to use." Dot said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Vera, how long have you known that?" Vera said, 17 years. She said it without apology. She said it in the tone of a woman who has been keeping something until the right person arrived to receive it, who has held a piece of information with the patience of someone who understood that patience was the form of protection available to her. Dot said, "Why didn't you tell me when I came to see you?" Vera picked up her coat from the stool. She said, "Because when you came to see me, you were still deciding if you were staying." She walked to the door. The bell rang. She was gone. Dot sat alone in the diner. The coffee machine had finished its cycle, and the room was quiet in the way it had been quiet the first night when she had stood at the threshold and heard the bell and been 12 years old for a moment. But the silence was different now, not empty, full of the evening that had just happened, which was itself full of the people who had come through the door, and the money in the shoebox, and the 23 notes in her hands. She walked to the corner booth by the window. She sat down in it for the first time since she had been a child, sitting in it with her homework and her plate of French fries, and her father moving behind the counter, and her mother calling through the kitchen window. The vinyl was cracked. The table surface held decades of wear scratches and rings from cups, and the particular patina of a surface that has been wiped clean thousands of times. The window beside the booth showed her the parking lot empty now, and the road and the dark beyond the tree line, and across the road, the quiet white shape of Vera's house, with one light on in the front room. Dot put her hands flat on the table. She thought about the water rights. She thought about the pending historical registration. She thought about Clifford's face when he said it. The quality in it that she now understood had been information rather than sentiment. A man who still knew things about the land that she was still learning. She thought about her attorney in Louisville who had handled their personal accounts separately from the ones Clifford had managed, and who had a number she could call on Monday morning. She thought about the 23 notes folded in her coat pocket. She thought about the names in the notebooks. She thought about the inspector's list in her other pocket, and the electrician Nadine had mentioned knowing a retired one who did good work for fair prices, and who had done the Dunning house 3 years ago. She thought about Nadine folding the apron, the way she had done it, the way it had looked like something being stored rather than finished. She sat in her father's booth in her father's diner with the lights still on and the parking lot empty, and the October night pressing against the glass. And she thought about what it meant to come back to a place that had been waiting for you without knowing it was waiting, that had held your name in an envelope and your inheritance in a drawer, and your future in a tin box kept by a woman across the road for 17 years. She had come here with 3 bags. She had come here because a man who no longer deserved her presence in his life had told her with the careful cruelty of someone who wraps removal in the language of homecoming that she belonged here. He had been trying to get rid of her. He had been in the only way he knew how to be completely right. She reached into her coat pocket and took out her father's letter. She unfolded it at the table, smoothing the creases with the back of her hand. The handwriting, the forward lean, the careful crossing of the T, The diner was never just a diner. She folded the letter and put it back. She reached under the counter and found the notepad her father had kept by the register, the one she had used to write Saturday's menu on the chalkboard, and she tore off a clean sheet. She found the pencil that had spent the evening behind her ear and took it down. She wrote 3 things. Attorney. Monday. County clerk. Historical property application. Water rights assessment. She looked at the list. Then she wrote a 4th thing smaller at the bottom. Corner booth. Keep it empty. She folded the list and put it in her pocket with the 23 notes and her father's letter. She turned off the lights. She went to the door. She pulled it firmly toward her until she heard the catch engage until the latch clicked. The way the latch had always been supposed to click, when you took the care to press it fully closed. She stood in the parking lot in the October dark and listened to the night and the ridge and the creek at the back of the property and the road that her father had refused to give up to people who wanted it for something else. Across the road, Vera's light was still on. Dot lifted a hand toward it. The light did not respond. Could not respond was only a light in a window. But she lifted her hand toward it anyway in the direction of the woman who had kept a tin box for 17 years and a piece of information for the same length of time, and who had known with the patience of a person who understood when waiting was the form of loyalty available to her that the right person would come back. The right person had come back. Dot put her hands in her coat pockets and walked across the yard to the farmhouse. The notebooks were on the kitchen table. The tin of cards was on the kitchen table. Her father's letter was in her pocket. The shoebox with the night's donations was in her hands. She set it on the table and sat down. She made herself a cup of tea from the tin she had found in the farmhouse pantry. Old tea that was still tea, and she sat at the kitchen table in the house where she had grown up, and she thought about the morning. She was 67 years old. She had come here with 3 bags and a keychain, and the accumulated weight of a life that had been managed around her until it collapsed. And she had come here because a man who intended to diminish her had pointed her without understanding what he was pointing her toward, at the one place that had always known what she was. The place her father had built. The place her father had left in a drawer. The place that had kept an envelope with her name on it in his handwriting for 17 years and had not let the dust settle on it. She sat at the kitchen table in the house on County Road 8 in Harlan County in October in the mountains, and she drank her tea, and she was home in the only way that word had ever meant anything, which was not the word for a structure you lived inside, but the word for the place that knew you before you knew yourself, that kept your name, that waited. Outside, the October night was cold, and the ridge was dark, and the creek ran behind the property the way it had always run, and across the yard, the Caulfield family diner stood with its sign, and its cracked steps, and its corner booth and its bell above the door. In the morning, she would call her attorney. In the morning, she would call the county clerk. In the morning, she would walk across the yard and open the door and hear the bell, and begin the work of bringing back what had been here all along. But first, she sat at her father's kitchen table and finished her tea. And the October night held the county road and the mountain and the diner and the farmhouse and the woman inside it, and everything was quiet and everything was still. And everything was exactly where it had always been, waiting for the morning to begin.